The North Atlantic, winter of 1942, an endless gray desert of water and wind where steel ships vanished without warning, and young sailors learned the sound of death long before they ever saw it. Allied convoys were being hunted, ripped apart by German U-boats that prowled beneath the waves like silent wolves. Crews lived in a world of constant fear, where a single echo on sonar could mean survival, or a cold grave under 1,000 feet of black water. And yet, in the midst of this desperation, an overlooked group of scientists and engineers, ordinary, exhausted, often dismissed, stumbled upon a strange acoustic phenomenon that seemed too absurd to believe. A crazy trick that made enemy submarines mistake migrating whales for battleships. A trick that would turn the tide of war, not with guns or armor, but with sound, raw, invisible, and terrifyingly powerful. This is the story of how a handful of ordinary people, armed with nothing but determination and a microphone dipped into the ocean, changed the course of naval warfare. It began with a man who rarely appeared in photographs because he hated the attention. His name was Maurice Ewing, a quiet American physicist with tired eyes, ink-stained hands, and a mind that processed sound the way painters saw color. To most military officers, he looked nothing like a hero, more like a professor who had wandered into the war by accident. And perhaps he had, but in 1942, inside a cramped laboratory that smelled of damp wool and old coffee, Ewing was listening to recordings from the deep ocean when he noticed something strange amid the static and mechanical thumps of naval experiments. He heard a low rolling rumble, too rhythmic to be a ship, too powerful to be nothing. It was the sound of a distant whale, but distorted, stretched, magnified by something hidden in the sea. That night, while others collapsed from exhaustion, Ewing replayed the same few seconds again and again, leaning closer to the speaker as if the ocean itself were whispering a secret. And behind that faint, haunting song, he detected an acoustic signature that mimicked heavy tonnage, so convincingly that even trained sonar operators might mistake it for a massive warship. It made his heart pound, not because the sound was beautiful, but because it was terrifying. If his ears were right, nature had created an underwater acoustic trap, one that could confuse the very submarines tearing Allied convoys apart. But Ewing's discovery wasn't greeted with applause. When he presented the recording to naval officers, they frowned, exchanged glances, and murmured about scientific imagination. One commander, frustrated by the rising death tolls, dismissed him outright. "We are fighting U-boats, doctor, not fish." Ewing left the room humiliated, clutching his notes as if they might vanish from sheer disbelief. But beneath the sting of rejection, a fire was growing. He couldn't forget that sound, how it surged, how it echoed as though traveling through a hidden tunnel in the deep. Something was amplifying it, something the Navy had never considered. And if he could map it, if he could understand its path, he might give Allied ships a new weapon: confusion. A weapon submarines could neither see nor resist. So he returned to the cold laboratory, sleeping in short bursts on a cot beneath chalkboards covered with equations. He listened to hours of tapes recorded from hydrophones dropped miles offshore. Most were useless: white noise, mechanical hums, the ocean breathing and shifting like an enormous living thing. But embedded within those sounds were clues: faint delays, sudden intensifications, frequencies that rose and fell with mathematical precision. Ewing began tracing them like a detective studying footprints in sand. And slowly, a pattern emerged. The ocean, he realized, wasn't just water. It was layered: warm water above, cold water below, forming a natural corridor that trapped and carried sound for hundreds of miles with almost no loss to Sofer Channel. A hidden highway beneath the waves. It was there that whale songs transformed into something monstrous. There, sound behaved in ways that defied intuition. And there, Ewing found his chance to change the war. But discovery alone didn't bring courage. As he prepared to present his findings a second time, he felt fear twisting in his stomach. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a commander, he was a physicist asking hardened naval officers to trust that the ocean itself could be an ally. Standing outside the briefing room, he gripped his notes until the edges tore. He wondered if he was wasting precious wartime resources chasing a phantom. He wondered if the dead sailors in the Atlantic deserved better than an academic's strange theory. But he also knew that sound did not lie, and if he stayed silent now, the convoys would continue to die. When he entered the room, there were fewer dismissive smirks. Losses had grown worse. Desperation softened skepticism. Ewing placed a hydrophone recording on the table and played it. The deep, resonant, battleship-like signature filled the room, shaking the air like distant thunder. The officers leaned closer. For the first time, they heard what he had heard. One asked, barely above a whisper, "That is a whale?" Ewing nodded. The room fell silent, not out of disbelief, but awe. Nature had handed them a riddle, and Ewing, the quiet man with ink-stained hands, had uncovered its key. He left that day not with victory, but with permission. Permission to investigate further, permission to test the impossible. Permission to turn the insane idea that whales could confuse submarines into a weapon that might save thousands of lives. And as he stepped back into the winter air, he felt something he hadn't felt since the war began. Not pride, not triumph, but responsibility. Because a discovery like this did not belong to curiosity alone. It belonged to every sailor drifting through the icy dark, praying for one more sunrise. He knew now that the ocean's secret could help them. But he also knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Proving it where it mattered, and not in laboratories, but in the unforgiving North Atlantic, where U-boats hunted without remorse. The second section will continue with the dangerous field tests, the skepticism, and the moment the German Navy realized the ocean had turned against them. The first test began far from the safety of chalkboards and lecture halls, in a place the sailors called the Black Water, a stretch of the North Atlantic where storms rolled without warning and where U-boat commanders claimed their deadliest victories. It was here, in the bitter cold of early 1943, that Maurice Ewing and a small team of oceanographers and sonar operators boarded an aging research vessel refitted for wartime duty. The ship groaned under every wave, its metal seams shivering like a creature trying to stay alive. Ewing felt the fear the moment he stepped on deck. Fear written in the faces of the crew, fear carried on the wind, fear rising from the ocean itself. He had asked for this test. He had demanded it. Now he had to face it. And somewhere beneath them, hidden in the ink-black depths, German U-boats were listening too. The mission was simple on paper. Drop hydrophones into the SOFAR channel, play back recordings of whale calls, and see if they produced the same deceptive acoustic signature that had stunned the officers months earlier. But paper didn't show the reality that every sailor knew. The German wolf packs were relentless. They stalked sound, they hunted vibrations, and any unusual noise in the ocean could draw them closer. As the first hydrophone slid into the water, the cable humming under tension, Ewing felt a twisting in his chest. He wondered if he had just given the enemy a beacon pointing straight to them. The ship's engines were cut to reduce noise, plunging the deck into a silence so complete that even the sea seemed to hold its breath. The cold wind needled through coats and gloves, and the crew waited in a tight circle around the sonar console, their breath fogging the red-lit cabin. When the speakers crackled to life, the sound was faint at first, a long, mournful moan drifting up from the abyss. Then another. Then a chorus. The whales were out there, vast and unseen, their voices stretching across miles of ocean. Ewing closed his eyes, not in peace but in calculation, feeling the frequencies as much as hearing them. And then it happened. The rumble deepened, thickened, transformed into the same heavy rolling echo he had captured in the lab. A signature that mimicked the displacement of a massive steel hull. The sonar operator, a veteran who had heard more death under the waves than most soldiers faced on land, leaned forward, his hands trembling. That's a battleship profile, he whispered. If I didn't know better. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. But the triumph lasted only seconds. A new sound pierced the cabin, sharp, rhythmic, mechanical. The operator stiffened. Contact bearing 085. Unidentified. The blood drained from Ewing's face. It wasn't a whale, it wasn't an echo, it was a submarine, and it was close. The crew scrambled as alarms sounded quietly, muted so as not to carry across the water. The captain ordered the engines to remain silent. They drifted, vulnerable, listening to the U-boat move in slow arcs. Every man on the ship knew what that meant. The enemy was hunting. Ewing felt sweat bead beneath his thick coat despite the freezing wind. Was the U-boat drawn by the whale sounds? Was it coincidence? Or had his experiment doomed them? Minutes dragged into eternity. The hydrophone picked up the unmistakable churn of a submarine adjusting depth. Then, nothing. Silence thicker than fear itself, the captain ordered the testing halted, the hydrophone retrieved, and the ship to move at minimal power. For hours, they crept through the waves like fugitives, praying not to hear the thump of a torpedo. Ewing sat alone on the lower deck, the metal cold beneath him, replaying the encounter again and again in his mind. Had he been reckless? Had the ocean punished his arrogance? But even as doubt crushed him, another thought forced its way through, a thought as sharp as lightning. The submarine came because it believed something big was out there, something large enough to be worth pursuing. The trick worked. Too well. Days later, when the ship finally returned to base, the crew walked off pale and exhausted. But a live Ewing, still grappling with guilt, presented the sonar recordings to naval intelligence. Officers listened as the whale calls transformed into the acoustic signature of a battleship. Then he played the recording of the U-boat approaching. The room stiffened, not with fear this time, but with realization. The ocean's trick could be more than a tool. It could be a weapon of deception, a way to lure submarines away from convoys, a way to make U-boats chase ghosts instead of blood. Yet even with proof in hand, skepticism dug in. Some dismissed it as luck. Some insisted submarines would quickly learn the difference. And some believed nature was too unpredictable to rely on. Ewing absorbed the criticism silently. But inside, something hardened. He had seen the truth out there in the black water. He had felt it in the ship's trembling hull. Sound did not need permission to change warfare. It only needed to be understood. And he would understand it, no matter how long it took, no matter how many storms he had to endure. Still, doubt lingered, not in his science but in himself. Because if he was wrong, if this strange acoustic deception failed, then young sailors would die believing a lie he had created. He carried that weight like an anchor, but he also carried something else, the memory of the U-boat turning toward a phantom battleship, chasing a creature it would never see. It meant the ocean could be persuaded, and that meant the war could be changed. Section 3 will dive into how the Allies weaponized the discovery, building devices, training sonar teams, and unleashing a new era of acoustic warfare that confused and frustrated the U-boat fleet. The transformation from strange discovery to battlefield weapon began in a dim, overcrowded workshop tucked behind a naval operations center in New London. It smelled of hot solder, damp uniforms, and the metallic sting of fear that clung to every wartime bunker. Here, amid coils of copper wire and stacks of discarded radio parts, Maurice Ewing and a handful of engineers worked around the clock to build something that had never existed before. A device that could mimic, amplify, and project the deceptive acoustic signatures born within the SOFAR channel. They didn't call it a weapon. They didn't dare. Instead, they labeled it an experimental acoustic generator, a bland name for an idea bold enough to reshape the war beneath the waves. And yet, for all its ambition, its components looked embarrassingly simple. An oversized underwater speaker, a modified amplifier, and a control unit barely held together by screws stripped from obsolete equipment. What mattered wasn't how it looked. What mattered was the sound it created. But sound was treacherous. In laboratories, the signals behaved predictably. In the open ocean, they twisted, stretched, and dissolved like smoke in the wind. Every test seemed to introduce new challenges. Some nights, the speaker produced a clear, resonant hum that rolled through the water with uncanny realism. Other nights, the team listened helplessly as the output dissolved into muddy echoes swallowed by the sea. Ewing felt the pressure mounting. Officers demanded results, sailors depended on them, and the clock of the Atlantic convoys never stopped ticking. He rarely slept more than a few hours, often dozing upright on a stool, waking only when his pencil slipped from his hand. The men working beside him were no different. Machinists with blistered palms, radio operators with red-rimmed eyes, young technicians who had lost brothers to U-boats but kept saucering wires with steady hands. They were ordinary people, but their determination turned the workshop into something almost sacred. A refuge where fear could be transformed into purpose. The breakthrough came during a midnight test in the harbor. The team had fitted a small patrol vessel with the latest prototype, its wires snaking across the deck like exposed nerves. Ewing stood beside the operator at the control panel, his breath visible in the cold air. When the speaker lowered into the dark water, he felt the same anxiety he had felt in the North Atlantic months earlier, the fear of being wrong, of wasting precious time, of chasing a phantom the war could not afford. The operator nodded. Ewing gave the signal. The device engaged with a rumbling drone that pulsed through the hull, vibrating in the ribs of the men standing nearby. Minutes later, the harbor's sonar station reported an incoming contact, a large, slow-moving surface vessel. There was no ship, no convoy, no battleship arriving unannounced. Only sound. And sound had fooled the machines completely. The officers observing the test stared in stunned silence. The implications were immediate and enormous. If the Allies could scatter these acoustic illusions across convoy routes, U-boats would waste torpedoes on empty ocean. If they could lure submarines into dead zones, destroyers could move in for the kill. If they could blanket the sea with false giants, real ships could slip by unnoticed. But even as excitement rippled through the team, Ewing felt the weight of a new burden settling onto his shoulders. In creating this decoy, he had entered a different kind of battlefield, one where deception replaced firepower, where survival depended not on armor, but on understanding how predators think. Sound had become a battlefield of its own. Training sonar operators became the next critical step. Young men, some barely out of school, crowded into makeshift classrooms to learn how to distinguish the ocean's natural chaos from the carefully engineered illusions now emerging from Allied ships. They practiced for hours with headphones pressed tight against their ears, beads of sweat forming despite the cold rooms. They learned how whales could sound like battleships, how echoes could masquerade as steel, how a single frequency could determine whether a convoy lived or died. Many struggled, some cried in frustration, but slowly, painfully, they began to hear what Ewing heard, the hidden language of the sea. And in those moments of understanding, even the most skeptical officers began to believe that the ocean was no longer neutral. It was becoming an ally. Meanwhile, German U-boat commanders found themselves facing an enemy they could not see and did not understand. Reports filtered through the Kriegsmarine of submarines pursuing massive signatures that vanished without trace. Captains described phantom convoys and ghost ships that lured them far from their hunting grounds. One commander wrote in his log about chasing what he believed was a battleship for 6 hours, only to find nothing but empty, endless water. At first, German intelligence chalked these incidents up to equipment failures or inexperienced crews. But as the encounters multiplied, confusion turned to frustration, and frustration turned to fear. Something had changed in the Atlantic. The ocean they once dominated had become unpredictable, deceptive, treacherous. Ewing followed these reports with quiet, conflicted eyes. He had never aimed to terrify anyone. He wasn't built for war, but he knew that every U-boat chasing a phantom meant one fewer stalking a real convoy. Every hour wasted in confusion meant lives saved, young men who would go home instead of sinking into the cold dark. And so he pushed forward, refining the devices, expanding deployment, teaching sailors how to wield sound as both shield and sword. He still doubted himself on sleepless nights, still felt the weight of responsibility, like a tide that never receded. But he also carried the memory of what drove him, the hope that somewhere in the Atlantic, a convoy that should have been doomed would see the dawn because of the strange trick born from a whale song. Section 4 will follow the moment the deception reached its peak, when entire U-boat packs were thrown into chaos, and the emotional toll Ewing faced as the war turned on the power of sound. By mid-1944, the Atlantic had changed in ways no commander, Allied or German, could have predicted. What once was a battlefield of tonnage and torpedoes had transformed into a world ruled by echoes, illusions, and the hidden corridors of sound that only a handful of scientists truly understood. Convoy routes, once carved in desperation, now threaded through carefully designed acoustic landscapes. Allied destroyers carried the new deception devices as standard equipment. And every night, under a moon like a pale coin floating above the waves, ship crews activated the strange, otherworldly hum that rose from the depths and drifted across miles of black water. It was subtle, almost ghostly. But beneath that quiet surface, it created chaos. It created doubt. and doubt Ewing knew was deadlier than any weapon the Allies had deployed so far. The effects were immediate and devastating. U-boat commanders, once confident hunters, began to question their own senses. Sonar screens that had guided them reliably for years now filled with conflicting signatures. Massive, slow-moving targets that flickered, merged, or dissolved like mirages on the desert horizon. Some skippers, stars, pursued these illusions deep into areas patrolled by Allied destroyers, believing they had found an undefended convoy. Others became paralyzed by hesitation, unsure whether the hulking presence on their instruments was real or another ghost born from the depths. Radio transcripts intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed the psychological toll. Arguments between officers, frantic recalculations, captains accusing their own equipment of betrayal. One transmission, recorded in brittle code and later translated, carried a tremor of fear. "The sea lies. It lies to us." Ewing read that line in silence, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. He sat alone in the corner of an operations room lit by dim yellow lamps, surrounded by maps and strike reports. The war was turning. The casualty numbers were falling. Convoys that once arrived battered and broken now completed their journeys intact. To the officers around him, it was cause for celebration. To Ewing, it was something far more complicated. He had dedicated his life to understanding the truth hidden in sound. Now he had weaponized that knowledge to spread confusion, to deceive, to manipulate the very fear that once haunted him. The irony was not lost on him, and some nights it weighed heavier than he admitted. But every time he faltered, he remembered the faces of sailors who had thanked him quietly in passing, faces young enough to still flicker with hope, hope that he had helped preserve. The peak of the deception came during what would later be called the Night of the False Titans. A massive Allied convoy pushing toward Britain detected a wolf pack closing in from the south, 9 U-boats coordinating with ruthless precision. Under previous conditions, the convoy would have been doomed. But by then, the escort ships carried the newest acoustic generators, capable not only of imitating whale signatures, but amplifying them into vast shadows, resembling entire fleets. The destroyers spread out along the convoy's flanks, feeding the ocean a symphony of artificial giants. Low-frequency rumblings rolled through the SOFAR channel like distant thunder. Within minutes, the U-boat screens lit up with what appeared to be multiple capital ships, battleships, carriers, heavy cruisers, moving in a formation that defied any rational pattern. Confusion rippled through the German ranks. Submarines broke formation, captains shouting contradictory orders, torpedoes fired not at actual targets, but at acoustic illusions drifting in empty water. Allied signal intelligence recorded chaotic chatter, panic disguised beneath clipped voices. And in the center of this storm of echoes, the real convoy slipped through untouched, its lights dimmed, its engines steady, its sailors unaware of how close death had come. Only the escort commanders truly understood what had happened. The ocean had been weaponized, turned into a labyrinth of phantom giants that left seasoned hunters blind and desperate. For Ewing, the victory brought no celebration. He watched the after-action reports with a stillness that unsettled even his colleagues. The weight of his success pressed down like deep water pressure, silent, crushing, inescapable. He couldn't help thinking about the men inside those U-boats, trapped in steel shells, choking on doubt and fear as their world collapsed around them. He was no sympathizer. He knew what the U-boats had done, how many ships they had dragged into the abyss. But he also knew that war was never a story of monsters and heroes, only people, scared and determined, caught in forces larger than themselves. One night, as the base settled into uneasy quiet, Ewing stood on the cold dock staring into the ocean. The water reflected nothing, no stars, no light, just an endless, dark surface that seemed to breathe. He wondered how a place so vast, so empty, could hold so much power. He thought of the whales whose voices had sparked everything, giants who navigated the deep long before humans learned to fight over it. And he realized that this strange, fragile phenomenon he had harnessed wasn't human invention at all. It was nature, vast, ancient, misunderstood, turned by human desperation into a shield. The war was shifting in the Allies' favor, but the emotional toll of that shift carved itself deeply into him, because he knew that behind every saved convoy, Every U-boat diverted, every sailor who lived to see port again, there was a fragile miracle. One born not of steel or fire, but of sound traveling through cold, unseen corridors beneath the waves.